Hello everyone, today we talk about Great Moravia, known also as Old Moravia or simply Moravia, known as also the first major state of predominantly Western Slavic identity, emerging in Central Europe and encompassing, as we will see now, a floating amount of territory, but that stretched across several states: Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, Germany, Poland, Romania, Croatia, Serbia, and Ukraine. This polity is quite famous in general because of the relative power that it managed to seize, especially after the destruction of the Avar Khaganate at the hands of the Franks. And so, in this situation that we have described, also in other videos, in which the Western and the Southern Slavs basically wouldn't have any political boundary between each other, right? Until the Magyars arrived and, in fact, basically brought down this same Moravian polity, right? In fact, the boundaries of which, as we will see now, are debated as much as the degree of political cohesion that this system really had, right? There had been a previous, system, basically stretching across the same territory, mostly. Today is one of Czech Republic and Slovakia. That is the tribal union of Samo, right? That is counted mostly as a tribal grouping rather than a single political entity. So and this had lasted essentially briefly, right, in the 7th century, between the 30s and the 50s. Great Moravia was longest living, but even here, even though we understand well the boundaries of what was essentially the core of this power, so today's Bohemia, Moravia, essentially good part of Slovakia, also this what was called Vyslania, right? And even some territories in the what would become the Hungarian, in fact, plain, that also ruled over other peoples around. For example, the Lusatians, the Silesians, the Transthasians, the Pannonians. Albeit being there still some historiographical debate that we will observe now regarding the actual, not just the actual extent, as we have said, but the possibility of this system being connected with another one on the Danube, essentially around the territories of today's Serbia. So we're talking about Sirmium, Belgrade, that were also another Morava river from which the name of this polity actually stems from, flows, as you know, aside from the one in fact at the boundaries between Austria, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and that may have actually been the Great Moravia. This is a somehow it's a controversial theory, but not because it's unfounded or actually those kind of nationalistic resurgences or anything. And we will explain now why, because we do have an evidence not just of the Slavs bridging this in fact pretty distant territories from central to southern to the Balkans fundamentally, but also the latter being substantially populated, having important elements in common, not just the fact that we're Slavic by a degree. There is also the issue where the Serbs come from. I made a video about that, the Sorbs, and so even here the northern connection, some possible movements later on, but also the general political interests, namely the defense from the most immediate neighbors at the time, the Carolingians, as we will see, and the Bulgars, right? At this point, actually, the Bulgarians as they had settled consistently. And naturally, other political issues, especially revolving the Christianization of these populations, arose from the context with Rome, with Constantinople, and I made some videos about Moravia. At least mention it in the title, Great Moravia, exactly in connection to the evangelization of, in fact, Central Europe. But here we will see a bit better what this was all about. Also because, famously enough, Great Moravia was the essentially the witness of the rise of the first ever Slavic literary culture in the Old Church Slavonic, right, following the arrival of Saints Cyril and Methodius, the creation of the Glagolitic alphabet, right, also actually a wasted opportunity, in as much as this area would be destabilized substantially to the point of even lacking further political unity. At least Moravia would start gravitating more, even assuming that this would have been the exact center. We will see now, at least surely that's where most of the power was concentrated, but it was very connected already with Bohemia, and as you know, the latter would prevail over time. But in general, the arrival of the Hungars, but also the previous competition within the same Moravians, and even essentially the proxy clash between the Romans and the Byzantines, brought to the at least to the Christianization, admittedly, but not to the permanent establishment of a center of culture that otherwise would have had already started being the one from which, for example, other lands like Galicia had started receiving this new alphabet from, right? That eventually would be replaced by the simpler Cyrillic, but that had started, in fact, from this Great Moravia. And there was really much more, right? The name, as I was saying before, Great Moravia, stems from the Greek, that is Megale Moravia, that figures in the De Administrando Imperio by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. I also made a video about them that describes, in fact, here's the passage, that there is an encyclopedistic say canon here, in which the emperor explains all the territories of the Romans and what lays beyond their frontier. Says there is Belgrade, in which is the tower of the holy and great Constantine the emperor. Then again, at the running back of the river is the renowned Sirmium by name. This would be today's Sremca Mitrovica. A journey of 2 days from Belgrade, and beyond lies Great Moravia, the unbaptized at this point, which the Hungarians have blotted out, but over which in former days the ones, as we'll see now, Svatopluk, used to rule. So such are the landmarks and names along the Danube River. Naturally, this is not the only source from which we know of the name, as we'll see now. So today I will skip any other, say, broader kind of geographical or historiographical issue. We will get down, albeit of course based still on the sources explicitly, to the evenemential history. So we will come back on the issues of Great Moravia, I mean the historiographical ones, but I will try to make a synthesis along the way also now, because much of this polity's relevance has to do with the degree we can, in fact, measure its power in the first place. And it's not easy, right? So there is no doubt about the accomplishment here that was definitely on the base of some pre-existing development, as we'll see now, of the local people and so on. But at the same time, it does feel in the bigger international game like a useful chance that especially the Slavs had this period to again bridge this gap that had divided them, right, from the west to the south, ever since the Avars had settled in the Hungarian plain. and starting to rule on them as well. So the earliest possible reference to the Slavic people in the area, essentially laying the valley of the northern Moravia River, is from Procopius, right, in the 6th century. Who talks about essentially the displacement of the Heruli after they had been crushed by the Longobards, essentially in the same lands of Moravia around there, that were essentially to come back to the north, towards the Jutland specifically. We're at the beginning of the 6th century, so most of the Slavic movements in the area had already started happening, but were not so substantial. Basically, even during the presence of the Longobards there, the Slavs began to settle. We know that because there are some Longobard tombs in Hungary or in Italy that have very similar genome to the one of today's Poland, for example. And by coming to the north, right, where they perceived they had originally stemmed, they herally cross through the territory of the Sclavades, right, which is another name for generally speaking the Slavs. We know, of course, that there was locally some culture, again, materially speaking, kind of isolated in itself as possibly the Slavic one that had already settled. By that point, nothing particularly developed. Again, at this point, the Slavs were mostly following the trail of other peoples and didn't have much of a political compactness. But we see already, and this is very interesting, a connection between this essentially, mostly this material culture is traced by handmade ceramics, right? That this fundamentally flows in this area, right, of the northern Morava River, right, especially at the confluence with the Middle Danube, spreading, having connections definitely with southern Poland, southwestern Poland, western Ukraine, right, and we are again in the 6th and mid-6th century. So in 568, the Pannonian Basin had been gradually settled by the nomadic Avars, as these people had made a pact with the Longobards that's before these moved to Italy for basically settling there temporarily. So this predominantly Turkic people, as you know, had created, initially it was actually, even at this point, relatively weak because they were all fragmented, that they would compact in a khaganate of really regional power that would start doing basically what also we will see the Magyars will keep doing later, essentially harassing Merovingian Germany at that point. The Avars actually mostly also Constantinople, compared to what the Magyars would do mostly against post-Carolingian Europe. And therefore, also lording over the, you see that the Pannonian, say the Hungarian plains as such were steppes, right? So what we have documented also in other videos is that all these other hilly, forested areas around this huge plain are populated by the Slavs that contain a pretty specific archaeological, character that we can distinguish from the Avars. Naturally, there are influences, but on the longer run, the Slavs tend to absorb more what was coming from the Frankish West, right? They were more just even as sedentaries, more similar, even just in a military sense, to Western Europe, etc. And such Slavs were naturally tributaries of the Avars up to a fairly long distance from the center of Avar power, right? They have their own political autonomies, they have their own forces, and these are essentially co-opted by the Avars, who send them, together with their horsemen, into those raids against the Byzantines, the Franks, the Longobards, etc. Right. So again, I have plenty of Slavic history videos, and I realized that we should make much more than that, because it's really one of the, we don't know enormously much, but that's one of the reasons why we have to be precise about certain things. So naturally, any polity here that we're describing by any community had a political identity of some sort. We know very few about that, but we also have to be pretty consistent about, say, again, how powerful they were, right? And most of this is to be measured, yes, in part to archaeology, in part to just the documentary evidence, but through also political and military analysis of some sort, right? So already, as we've seen in the 7th century, there had been, right, a phase of important rise of this, again, from the side of the Samo, that was a Frankish merchant, apparently, who managed to invest successfully in these areas to make leverage on kind of the Slavic autonomistic ambitions to coalesce them politically, right? And part of the same territory of Great Moravia had already been under both, naturally, the rule of the Avars, and also the one of Samo's confederacy, right? Throughout this time, the Avars maintained, however, the upper hand, in spite of their own internal struggles, settling ever more, right? Essentially softening up. Right? That's the reason why also they fundamentally give way to the Carolingians that had spotted this weakness and launched, as you know, a massive military expedition to crush the Khaganate once for all. It was a pagan power. It had been annoying basically everybody around, and naturally much of the Frankish political action had been carried out, even in this case, through the Slavs, right? We will see also later that fundamentally, in spite of all the troubles existing between the Franks and the Moravians, at the end of the day, they fought at least against the major Magyar onslaught, getting defeated, by the way, in the process. So naturally, the Avars had left a trace, entering in a symbiosis with the Slavs, even abandoning in part their own nomadic lifestyle. And this had occurred surely also through, as we've seen, cooptation, marriages between the two ethnic aristocracies, which contributed during the 7th and the 8th century to the political and social development of the same Slavic tribes. Right, these areas were, generally speaking, quite poor. We are in early medieval times, and these places were in the former Barbaricum, beyond the Roman frontiers that already weren't particularly populated or developed by themselves. So there had been a substantial crisis demographically, economically. We're talking about, say, a great material misery generalized practically throughout all Eurasia. These areas were definitely not particularly among the richest or having a great surplus. But the latter starts appearing, right? We see fundamentally an elite rising in areas such as Moravia, Slovakia, Bohemia, especially mounted warfare increasing in importance. The Slavs historically were, again, mostly foot troops, right? They had always had some degree of cavalry, but it had not been dramatically developed. They mostly were influenced by also the steppe peoples, but also the Franks. And it was, however, just for political and social reasons that their elites began to put together enough surplus from the, generally speaking, lording over the peasantry and being able to keep themselves, to have mostly the resources for training themselves for a lifetime as mounted warriors, right? It cost really a lot. So a bit all Europe, as you know, was going towards that direction. During the 8th century, when there is a substantial revival of European economy, you start seeing impressive fortified settlements for the area. Consider that there hadn't been cities historically in this area. So basically these were the most important centers that were growing as fortified rings where the harvest, the cattle were sheltered, ruled by, in fact, this local elite with some armored retinues that could man the walls, exacting the tolls, bringing order around on the rest of the population inhabiting outside, given the frequent raiding warfare. This, the peasantry would mostly take refuge within this fortified settlements during the emergencies. So the classical process of encapsulation by a degree. The story here is pretty long, so I don't have, unfortunately, time to digress on, say, the complexity of these fortified systems, because archaeologically some are identified, etc. But naturally, for most medieval fortifications, and not just at this time, you have to imagine a great load of other smaller castles, put in this way, in some of the most impervious, savage areas. You can imagine how Central Europe was in the 8th century, right? Forests, swamps, especially in this kind of river, among these important riverways. So any terrain folding was good for some kind of further entrenchment. The Slavs, as we've seen, for having mostly sheltered themselves against this reign of nomadic peoples in the forest, in the mountains, were known as fanatic defenders, to say the least, and they now were accumulating enough wealth also to decisively coordinate and passing to the counteroffensive, as we will see now in a broader sense. And everything politically passes through these mechanisms that, however, are not documented, right, unfortunately. So again, we are aware of Great Moravia as it develops as a regional power, but we do not have much of an idea of what was happening in detail right there. We can't just guess these mechanisms. So especially these fortified settlements unambiguously concentrate around the river Morava, right? We know in Slovakia the oldest Slavic fortified settlement being documented, at least for the last decades of the 8th century. These areas had, as we were saying before, been under a degree of Avar influence. They surely had contributed. I mean, the Avars had, just like steppe peoples, their fortified rings. They had surely just been an example, even of these kind of fearful kind of knightly lords coming to exact tribute, to being obeyed. So they offered even a degree of leadership model, right? However, this system that the Moravian Slavs had, let's call it in this way at this point, been developing, were stretching far beyond this say the useful area of our influence. Naturally, political influences arrived very far, but say things like tribute, especially, could be exacted just at useful range, right? There are some northern avamposts, such as Orava or Spiš, that are basically northeastern Slovakia, that may have not been particularly under this, might have developed much more autonomously, right, and also contributing to this degree of further autonomization of the rest of the Slavic settlements under the Avar rule in their northern frontier. So we know, of course, of the variation of, for example, of pottery, the existence through it of at least 3 tribes inhabiting the wider region in the northern Morava River by Charlemagne's time, right? And we are talking about substantial, sites near modern Bratislava, Brno, Olomouc, and the fortresses erected at Bratislava, the Rajhrad, the Stare Mesto, etc., are also from roughly Charlemagne's time, and they are definitely evidencing the important growth as centers of power in these regions, right? So, as we were saying before, the Carolingians waged this massive expedition. Just the first one against the one of 774 against the Longobards was a bigger logistical deal than the one against the Avars, right? This was a massive army supported by a river fleet on the Danube, marching across, actually, let's say, along both banks, coordinated with many subjected peoples and so on, that brought properly to the collapse of the Avars, right? So much so, and this is interesting, the Royal Frankish Annals claims that, quote, the Avars could not stay in their own previous dwelling places on account of the attacks of the Slavs, right? So what is evident here is, aside from the fact that the Carolingians allowed in Aachen in 805 on demand the Avars to settle in the lowlands along the Rab River, so being displaced, in fact, from some of their even properly core center, the fact that the Slavs had basically taken advantage dramatically of the Avar destruction, and that basically we're now starting to push this broken people away. Right? Political cohesion ceases to be. The Slavs take on the initiative and start entering the Hungarian plain. Right. So again, from an international point of view, if you know the political map of Europe at this point, you do know that between the Carolingians and the Bulgarian Empire, both of which are, say, in their centers of power are diametrically distant, because one is respectively in the northwest from there, and the one in the southeast. There is this huge space where practically that had been occupied by the Avars prior, and that now cannot really be simply taken over by either the Franks or the Bulgarians, right? They actually, we do know that some skirmishes between the Franks and the Bulgarians occurred in these spaces that, yes, of course, the places could be crossed and rich and whatever, but in terms of political stability, the only ones that are benefiting concretely from this huge gap are the Slavs, that, as we've seen, have not yet developed, however, much of a power on their own, right? They're all tribes still. They definitely are already profiling themselves in some kind of greater groups, but they do lack political cohesion. Their elites do not have the capacity to put more than a certain amount of forces together. They quarrel with one another. They are jealous, naturally, of each other's accomplishments, so they kind of fragment or recompact according to this kind of balance. But they do swarm in this place across this area. Also because, naturally, even within the Avar Khaganate, as we were saying before, that there had been historically Slavs all around, right? They had, but the majority of the population had been arguably something like, Slavic, mostly Germanic. There were other peoples, right, that had just even blended the previous, I don't know, the Pannonians, the Romanized peoples, whatever. And this opportunity allows, as we've seen, the already potentially capable Moravian elites to seize more power and to start agitating the area further, and or especially agitating the outskirts of this, and especially the Carolingian frontier, because this is the one that at least as we consider Great Moravia, the northern Moravia, right, not the one in Serbia, we will be talking about, right? In the process, by the way, we definitely see that Moravian elites start becoming more powerful. We see, for example, a broader westernization, because in general, the collapse of the Avars had brought to a further Germanic expansion, colonization, and we've seen it in the video about medieval Styria. We will talk about the Carantanians and so on. Essentially, the Germans start colonizing what is essentially today's southern Austria, right? And further, here with the Moravians, we're just northeast of that, right? So an area that the Franks had not quite ventured by that point, or at least with much success, because it was very complicated to rule over such fragmented politically areas. Also, again, the terrains are really tough, and it's complicated, as we will see now, even just to reduce these people to obedience just with punitive raids at Semilia. We see the Slavs getting a bit more Frankish in military equipment, especially this areas, as you know, we're talking about Bohemia, Moravia, etc., will be encompassed within the Holy Roman Empire later. Would have a big deal of Germanic colonization, and already at this point during the migration era, yes, we can't say in general that from one side there were the Germans, from the other side there were the Slavs, but what really laid in between was a much less kind of distinguishable thing, right, for which they naturally were pretty similar in many ways. But it's mostly the degree of political and social development there that matters. We see a new type of archaeological profile known as the Blatnica Mikulčice I that emerges in the valley of the northern Morava River and spreads in the surrounding region. There is here still a lot of, especially late Avar influence mixed with the Carolingian one, right, which tells us naturally that these Western Slavs had a considerable Avar influence, even in their equestrian warfare, in their zoo techniques, and so on. Considering that they were just more unstable settlements, so it's unfair to call them semi-nomadic, but they knew how to move. They knew how to take refuge into places, moving the cattle, etc., because simply just the grounds were not particularly fertile, and the situation, as we've seen, it was so without too much surplus, it was difficult to sometimes hold some territories permanently. But definitely the establishment of hill forts, of these important fortresses, in general, was the measure of the gradual stabilization of this territory from a political profile. So naturally there was a deep connection with the Carolingians, even more at this point, right? The Slavic elites would draw what was best from them, was the especially functional to their own aggrandizement. Internationally speaking, diplomatic relations were at least say an important mean of legitimization from these peoples that were definitely gravitating at this point around the Carolingian Empire. We could talk about them as client states of some sort, right? So Moravia, as Great Moravia, emerges from the gradual tribal unification of the Slavs settled north of the Danube. This is why we call this like the first state, because it's not just a people or let's say a group of tribes, properly a conscious political step that they took in starting acting together for a consistent amount of time that naturally saw loss of, still secessions and crises and general weakening. This Great Moravia would eventually end, right? But that is still very meaningful because it allows us to talk about a sort of state by those times and places standards. The problem, in fact, with this concept is that we do not really have much, say, formal evidence of this Moravian power. We find some strong men, we find definitely a territorial control, an international recognition, but again, what was happening within is mostly unknown, right? So there is a debate regarding also, for example, an archaeological base. When can we start talking about this polity by a degree? It's maybe like a relatively important question and not excessively. In any case, in 811, the Royal Frankish Annals, we find the information that our rulers and the duches, or in fact the leaders of the Slavs who live along the Danube, visited the Carolingian Emperor Louis the Pious in the imperial palace of Aachen, which means that naturally these Moravian leaders were already represented even individually, right, independently from one another prior to the establishment of the broader polity, right? And of course the Carolingians interacted with them. 11 years later, we have a reference to the Moravians, or Maravani, right, as they're called in the source, when Louis the Pious received the embassies of basically this peoples, the Obrodrites, so in the eastern frontier of the empire, the Obrodrites, the Sorbs, the Vilsi, the Bohemians, in fact the Moravians, the Predecenti, and still from the Avars that were living in Pannonia. This event specifically took place in an assembly in Frankfurt am Main. Not particularly far away places, but remember that the distances are also cultural in some ways. Then we have, from the late 9th century, where at the end of the Carolingian Empire, Conversio Bagoariorum et Carantanorum, so the conversion of the Bavarians and the Carantanians, the reference to the first reference, in fact, to a great Moravian ruler as such, right? At this point, consider that the Carolingians had been carrying out an important degree of evangelization of peoples like, in fact, the Carantanians, that were the first Slavic ones to accept Christianity essentially from Rome, right? As a concept, these were bordering, as we will see, the Moravians, and naturally they evidenced generally speaking, the cultural and political penetration of the Western Empire among the Western Slavs, right? This process was described later in the same source, which states that Moimir, called Duke of the Moravians, expelled a certain Pribina across the Danube. So Moimir would be, in fact, the first known ruler of the Moravian Slavs, right? Something around the 20s, the 30s of the 9th century up to the mid 9th century, as we will see now. As far as Pribina, who took shelter in the Mark of Pannonia, so in the eastern Mark, in the frontier of the Carolingian Empire, ruled by the local official Radbot, in fact, began to side against Moimir, backed by the Carolingians. But we do not know who this Pribina technically was. Some believe that he was just an official in Moimir's establishment in some way, or the ruler of an autonomous state. The Principality of Nitra has been hypothesized, right? And we do not understand in that sense whether Moimir already controlled this principality as a greater ruler of the area, or if instead the exile of Pribina derived from, in fact, the conquest from the Principality of Moravia that lays just north of the one of Nitra had taken place. Right? These are just hypotheses. In any case, we start seeing definitely these Slavs fighting from the within for power dynamics that eventually had gotten big enough for making this situation escalate. The 9th century catalogue of fortresses and regions to the north of the Danube by the Bavarian geographer, right, that basically describes lists practically the tribes in Central and Eastern Europe. And this is where we get to the controversy between the northern and the southern Moravia. That the Moravians, or that are called Marari here, Marharii, had 11 civitates, that is to say, some districts that naturally corresponded to some fortresses, and he locates these people between the Bohemians and the Bulgars. However, there is another people known as the Mereani, Merehani, having 30 fortresses. The text literally says, among the Bohemians are 15 fortresses, the Marari have 11 fortresses, the region of the Bulgars is immense, that numerous people has 5 fortresses, since their great multitude does not require fortresses. The people called Mereani have 30 fortresses. Now, to make the long story short, what has been hypothesized by some legitimate scholarship is that, albeit, as we will see now, there is at least one major problem, which is maybe just apparently the case of, that the first Moravians, let's simply call them like this, having 11 fortresses, would be more or less, again, the neighbors of the Bohemians in what is the historical region of Moravia. I made a video, by the way, about medieval Moravia, in which I addressed partly, in fact, the great Moravian issue as well. But that there was another Moravia somewhere, and here evidently, like, given that the thing progresses here, the order from Bohemians, the Moravians, then talked about the Bulgars, right? So you would expect something going south, right? These are Moravians with 30 fortresses. So they're basically as big as, even actually more than the Bohemians and Moravians combined. They are thrice more powerful than the Moravians, right? Now, what about this? It's practically impossible to answer this with certainty, but the hypothesis that was made is that the Great Moravia, because indeed the Administrando Imperii, this Megale Moravia, as we've seen in Greek, has been thrown around, but in the context there, it wouldn't be much Great Moravia, but the Old Moravia. I mean, the one that once upon a time had been the big deal. That's the meaning in the Byzantine text. And so then there were other Moravians that at that point, as we've seen, were under the Magyars. And I made a video about the Eastern Frankish frontier, the relation between the Bohemians, Moravians, the Magyars. You can go check that video if you're interested out. But the thing being, there would be a southern Moravia, bigger one, actually, that may have even, again, have to do with this bridge formed between, in fact, today's Moravia and Serbia. The latter thinking that the latter would be, in fact, the seat of a substantially fortified area, which may have been the case, because if you consider Belgrade, Sirmium, a bit older Romanized frontier, this was essentially, on the right bank of the Danube, part of the Byzantine Empire, but we will see this because we will be resuming, hopefully, some Serbian history, some autonomous peoples, right, that were, yes, within, especially given that they were mostly hammered by the Bulgarians at this point, within still the Byzantine world, autonomized enough on the continental foothills of the Dinaric Alps. So from a fairly decentralized area that in this cradle, right, between the Danube and the mountains, with substantially and importantly strategic centers. I mean, Belgrade, Sirmium, those are literally the keys to Central Europe. They would be for the Byzantines, for the Ottomans, also in reverse for the Hungarians towards the south. So that area, compared to mostly, again, Bohemia, Moravia at the time, would have been more advanced, more fortified, more urbanized by a degree, and properly urbanized, which those places had never de facto been historically, as we were noticing before. And when the Avars were knocked out, the Slavs that inhabited both in this southern Moravia, that would take the name from the Morava in the affluent of the Danube in Serbia, right? And this northern Moravia, taking the name from Morava, that, as you know, has to do with water, river, marshes. That's the etymology. It's like the Latin mare, or the margit in Germanic. I mean, it's always the same. The same Moldova as well, somewhere else. But again, they would have united, they would have met in between and formed a sort of power, right? At least it's difficult to define. It was not a state, was not really even a confederacy, but a general union, right? A communion, if you want, something like the stripe, mostly controlled by Slavs, keeping out the Carolingians and the Bulgarians, trading extensively across the Danube that basically links these two areas, and so having an important leverage also internationally as far as the relation with Constantinople, with Rome were concerned, etc. Right, and this idea I find particularly fascinating, and we will actually scope it better when talking about Serbian history, because some people have gone as far as saying that the Great Moravia here, that we mostly and historiographically conventionally call like this one based on roughly the modern territories of Czechia and Slovakia, etc., was not the big one. The big one was the one in the south, right? The counter to this is that there wasn't much of a real Moravian power that we can necessarily, even just as a name, identify even in the area of Serbia at this point. Because the Moravians at that point, in internationally, as we will see now with the political, military, diplomatic relations, were these guys in the modern day Moravia, roughly, right? So this remains an hypothesis based on the Bavarian geographer that we cannot really confirm or verify, etc. In any case, the relations with the northern Moravians were definitely increasing as far as the Carolingians were concerned. For example, we have a 13th century source, the history of the bishops of Passau and the dukes of Bavaria, stating that the bishop of Passau, Reginar, that was in office from 818 to 838, baptized, quote, all the Moravians in 831. Now, this is a very late source, as you understand, and in fact, we do not actually have any other information contemporary to the 9th century about this, right? Scholars debated whether at this point, for example, the aforementioned Moimir, the first ruler of what we approximately identify as Great Moravia, had been converted or not. Definitely Christianity was around. It wasn't something new, as we will see now. The same Moravians began to found churches, monasteries, to organize, greatly speaking, their own conversion, talking with Constantinople and with Rome. We surely know from the life of Methodius that by the time, by say the 60s of the 9th century, there had been Italian, Greek, and German missionaries arrived in Moravia. Right. The life of Constantine also says that missionaries from the Eastern Frankish kingdom had basically been compromising with this Western Slavs regarding the offers, the sacrificial offers to God at that point that were basically a continuation from pagan rites. So that's sort of course, of hybrid mindset would have gone on for quite a while. And here we are basically in the decades after, say, we are in the mid-9th century, right? Nothing strange. Again, Christianization was necessary as far as the establishment of more permanent territorial control through infrastructures, foundations, annexed immunities, right? A sort of idea of sacred would substantiate itself in actual infrastructure designed to support a more central power, right? At this point, warfare, however, breaks out properly between the Eastern Frankish kingdom and the Moravian Slavs. In fact, according to the annals of Fulda, around August the 15th, 846, Louis the German, the king of East Francia, waged war against this people. And we do not know exactly why, right? We know that after this Moimir was not ruling anymore, so it's been speculated that either the Franks intervened because Moimir had been assassinated or died in some circumstance between these clashes within the Slavs, and say chaos ensued. So somebody called them, and they, generally speaking, exploited the local instability to affirm themselves. Others say that it was the Franks who actually took out Moimir. That was either perhaps dethroned during the campaign. In any case, we know with certainty that Louis the German would appoint Moimir's nephew, Rastislav as the new Duke of Moravia during such campaign. So we're talking about Dux Moravia. So just not the here, as we will see now, the greater Moravia for the eventual conquest and expansion that this policy would have achieved, but still as this guy who was essentially the most powerful one in the area, and so acted already as the broader head of this dominion. Naturally, the objective of the Carolingians was to turn these peoples into some sort of clients, to gradually control them, to send officials to rule over them, to colonize the area, and so on. And equally, the Slavs didn't like very much the idea, but they were also compelled to at least cooperate with the Germans and to exploit at least this opportunity of having essentially a more powerful ruler recognized locally. Again, the nobility especially didn't like this. Paradoxically, it was the people that was more favorable to that, because at least a sole ruler would bring more order as opposed to this other competition. But in any case, just the inherent conflict between the two sides, etc., would bring to the, by metus hostilis, to the compaction of a greater Moravian power. Right, and in fact, around this time, it's likely that Rastislav occupied the Slanske Hills, right, a range of mountains in eastern Slovakia that had an important strategic relevance, and that there is a possibility, perhaps even even though a scarce one, that properly the concept of Great Moravia, of the old Moravia, that Constantine VII was talking about in the Administrando Imperio. The power of Rastislav is mirrored also by the fact that he interfered with the internal affairs of Eastern Francia by supporting the rebellion of Radbod, the essentially East Frankish prefect of the Eastern Mark, right, the Bavarian frontier towards the Slav. In fact, it had been appointed in 833. Right, as a consequence, the Eastern Frankish king retaliated by invading Moravia in 855. Right, and the annals of Fulda register that the Moravians on this occasion were defended by strong fortifications, so that the Franks couldn't quite attract them, right, bait them out. On the contrary, they had to be careful where they were stepping themselves, and retreated from Moravia, in fact, without having neutralized the enemy. This tense situation continued through various skirmishes, raids, etc., until the peace of 859. Right, so this already gives you the profile, basically the pattern of what the Eastern Frankish expeditions in Moravia would be. Largely, say, raids, scorched earth strategy, attempted sieges, right, of impregnable positions. Again, the fact that somebody is just entrenching himself into a fortification is not a display of strategic superiority at all, right? But still, it's something designed to gather some defensive advantage and putting the offender that is more powerful to have invaded you and starting to threaten you in that way, but not to go too further than that, and actually suffering some casualties attritionally through guerrilla and so on. Right, so just imagine the theater, because it's very fascinating. I plan to start a mini-series about, in fact, exactly this the Eastern Frankish Slavic frontier, and warfare in it, specifically strategy and tactics, because it's really fascinating. It's one of the single most brutal scenarios of high medieval warfare. So that at this point it was evident that Moravia was there to stay as a substantial policy, that the Eastern Frankish kings that had objectively really a lot of things to think about to get within the whole empire, the competition with the other kingdoms, and the fact that there were basically multiple, as you know, ethnic duchies together, so it's as if Moravia had just been one of them, say, as much as it would become later during the Holy Roman Empire, right? There was Bavaria, there was Moravia, there was Bohemia, there was Thuringia, and so on. So they all played with one another, right? What Rastislav was doing was, as we've seen with this same Eastern Frankish rebellions, basically what the same Franks were doing often against their monarch, right? And in fact, Rastislav supported the rebellion of Carloman, the same son of Louis the German, in 861. Right, Carloman rebelled against his father, and so received help from the Moravians that naturally were aiming at weakening the Eastern Frankish monarch's power. This tells naturally how dependent the same members of the ruling dynasty were on the local, say, polities that were involved. By that point, we've seen it in other contexts, that it's not much that these people hated their own parents or whatever. It's that they had to rule in places that whose nobility would force them into rebellion at some point against, with the risk of losing the entire thing themselves and being considered some losers in the first place. What is also fascinating is that during these events, the first raid by the Magyars in Central Europe may have occurred. This is another pattern that would continue, in fact, long after the demise of Great Moravia, that the Magyars have started in these decades to, first of all, arrive in Europe. They first were somewhere between the Black Sea and the Carpathians, that would move into the Hungarian plain. But war bands were already around and were being hired, as we will see now, both by the Moravians and the Germans against one another. Specifically for 862, the Annals of St. Bertin speaks of these Hungarians ravaging Louis the German's kingdom, which suggests that they were siding with the rebellious Carloman and with Rastislav. I say Rastislav, it's actually Rastislav. And the efforts of the Moravian leader at this point were directed also to establish some privileged relations with the papacy, right? Because if this was a useful way to avoid, the Carolingian conquest, right? Christianizing and thus, starting to cooperate with this broader West that was essentially, especially in Bohemia and Moravia, to take over, right? As we will see now, there was also Byzantine influence in Moravia, but it was not to last substantially. And this occurred, in fact, because Rastislav did send envoys to Pope Nicholas I in the same 861, as the year of that revolt, but for reasons that may have been connected with the general support that Rome gave to the Eastern Frankish establishment at that point. The demand, the Moravian demand to send missionaries, in Central Europe, in Moravia, to master the Slavic language for facilitating the evangelization was not responded, or was probably not addressed by the papacy. So this probably was a big deal for Rastislav, who realized that at least somebody had realized was game he was playing, and that would turn to Constantinople at that point, essentially making the same request to Emperor Michael III. So this relation with Constantinople placed Moravia in a sort of anti-Frankish, but also anti-Bulgarian alliance. Right, the Bulgarians mostly had their center of power in Thrace, right, roughly today's Bulgaria, so south of the Carpathian Mountains. In theory, they controlled the same Carpathian Basin, and as we've seen, their power ideally stretched even up to the Hungarian plain until the Magyars settled there. But it's obvious that a Moravian expansion towards the south would have mechanically placed the Bulgarians in attrition with Rastislav, right? So at least strengthening the relations with Constantinople could be a safeguard even as far as the southeastern frontier was concerned. And Michael III was responsive, differently from the papacy, sending, famously enough, two brothers, Constantine and Methodius, the future saints Cyril and Methodius, who did speak Slavic because they had just been part of the evangelization of the Bulgarians. They came from the region of Thessaloniki, and they reached Moravia in 863, famously enough. So the life of Constantine narrates how this first Slavic alphabet, used to translate the gospel, the Old Church Slavonic, was developed on this occasion. It was a huge deal. It was essentially a mix between the Hellenic script and essentially the runic one that the Slavs primitively used, and it was designed to fundamentally create a hybrid between the two scripts and giving properly a literary best to the Slavic language at that point. Interestingly enough, Louis the German in August 864 crossed the Danube and invaded Moravia again. Right, this is interesting, especially the August. Right, the fact that the Eastern Franks would launch this offensive. After all, at the end of the good season in Central Europe, because this kind of Slavic frontier was relatively less important than other theaters. In any case, Louis besieged Rastislav in a place known as Dovina in the local language, according to the annals of Fulda, and also this time the Carolingians could not take the fortress. Right. However, the display of power had been so great that Rastislav basically agreed to accept Louis the German's suzerainty. He didn't have much to lose from it, because after all, it was a way for the Carolingians to say, okay, we used this massive force, we showed again that we have the upper hand. Generally speaking, you can entrench yourself into your fortresses, but we can raid all around, so it's better if we agree that you are our men there, but you tend to keep quiet. Right. The thing was more complicated than this, because Rastislav kept supporting the Eastern Frankish rebels in his life. For example, there was a certain Count Werner that was stripped by Louis the German of his public offices, according to the annals of Fulda, because this specific count was suspected to have, in fact, plotted with Rastislav against the same Louis. And this tells really a lot about the nature of this frontier, where the same Germans were trying to autonomize themselves in this what was de facto an elective monarchy. As you know, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, it was still ruled by the so-called, say, ethnic leaders, right, separated by, in this provinces separated by sometimes unsurpassable forests, etc., with very difficult communications. So again, Central Europe is a huge, boundless space, especially without a real eastern frontier, right? You have this, consider that Germany had been conquered by the Franks fully only during the 9th century, so some areas had yet to be properly colonized, deforested, and it would take a long time, right? Until the 12th to 13th century, Germany wasn't really very different from the previous ones. Just gradually towards the east, things went wilder, right? So it was ever more complicated and difficult to intervene. Because the problem with these peoples is that, as we've seen, you couldn't even basically invade their land, making a mess there and so on, but you couldn't quite hold them. Because they would simply entrench themselves in their hill forts, and it was it, right? There was no other resources locally to protract a siege, to maintain an army with the scarce resource. So these guys would eventually come back raiding, plotting, interfering, calling war bands from the outer world, as we've seen, and starting to make leverage on the internal frailties of the entire system. In an era like this, when, as you know, the Carolingian Empire was gradually declining, entering in crisis. Arguably, though, the Eastern Frankish world still substantially worked, right, at least in this more kind of brutal military outlook that still, after all, made what we call the Holy Roman Empire in the following century. In this, the evangelization was going on, and interestingly enough, consider at this point there hadn't been the schism, not even the Phocian one between Rome and Constantinople, so there was still a cooperation between the papacy and the Byzantines, in spite of, naturally, the conflict, right? At least this cooperation would allow the papacy to extend a degree of control and coordination on the mission of Cyril and, let's say, Constantine, still at this point, and Methodius. In fact, both these the Byzantine brothers visited Rome in 867, and the current Pope Hadrian II sanctioned the two brothers' translation of liturgical texts in Old Slavonic, and ordained also 6 of their disciples as priests, by the way. So this was important because there was a ceremony also across Rome where, there were some church chants in Slavic for the first time, and this was a very shrewd maneuver to almost hijack the Byzantine mission, right, by giving it essentially a papal vest. And again, today we do not have time to digress, but definitely this thing was happening under strict coordination with the Carolingian Empire, and of which de facto the papacy at that point really was. Hadrian also informed 3 prominent Slavic leaders, one of which was Rastislav, the others Svatopluk, or Sviatopolk if you prefer, his nephew, and Kotzel, that was the son of the aforementioned Pribina that had fled in quarantine. You remember that? And it was administering Lower Pannonia, in fact, at this point, of his approval of the use of this vernacular Slavonic in the liturgy, in a letter of 869. This was, again, a huge deal, because at that point, just Latin, Greek, and Hebrew were liturgical languages recognized by Christianity officially, at least by the empire, right? And Slavonic was added at this point. In the same 869, Methodius was sent by the Pope to the same three leaders. However, Methodius visited only Kotzel, who also sent him back to the Pope. We don't know exactly what happened there. It's likely that there were some either competition between the three, there were some also different political opinions internally, especially from the side of the nobiliar resistance against a Christian systematization of their country, and so on. Hadrian, however, consecrated at this point Methodius as archbishop with the title of Metropolitan, guess of where? Of Sirmium. So, in other words, one of those, say, in that area that we may think was maybe the greater Moravia, the southern one, the one with 30 fortresses, while the northern one had only 11. This is just like a guess. Remember that Methodius, again, was Byzantine, so technically Sirmium was, famously enough, the see of Saint Andronicus. There was all a sort of, general conventionality in such an appointment, right? What is fascinating here is the fact that the papacy, we have seen it in the video about the Duchy of Croatia, had at this point a great influence still on the Danubian area, right? Even in late Roman time, let's say the Greek influenced areas, even though the Balkans belong to the historically to the Eastern Roman Empire, so you may think that those were more influenced by the Greeks, right? Actually, the continental part of Central Europe, say north of the Balkan Mountains, in the Danubian area, in fact, Sirmian here, etc., was more Romance influenced. This is something you can spot even in the modern languages of Croatian or Serbian, etc., that there is a substantial Latin mark there, just as much as there is with Romanian, that, however, is a properly Romance language, not a Slavic one like the former two, but still, right? I mean, in terms of area of cultural influence, etc., see it even from the aforementioned perspective of the Avar collapse, and so the fact that that area of Central Europe had de facto fallen into the Carolingian sphere, right? The Carantanians now were being essentially ruled by the, say, with difficulty, as we've seen also for other Slavic peoples there, by the Carolingians, but still, right? So it was a way to affirm further the Western presence there, in spite of, still playing by the book, right? And as far as this Byzantine missionaries were concerned. In all this is still, however, worth mentioning that Kotzel's even decision to support Methodius stemmed from a more like an autonomistic policy, right? So not much a coordination with the Franks per se, especially after the subjugation, but at least formally, of Rastislav after the invasions of Lydipius. It was also a way to come closer from Central Europe, perhaps, to other influences, the Bulgarians, the Byzantines. In any case, warfare resumed in Moravia. At this point, the land, as we've seen, was being ruled by Rastislav. However, his nephew Sviatopluk had been ruling over the principality of Nitra under his uncle's suzerainty. It's not clear historically how this happened. There were no documents sanctioning that, etc. However, at this point, when the Eastern Franks invaded, in fact, both Moravia and the Principality of Nitra, etc., the hostilities resumed substantially. The annals of Fulda are eloquent about, especially the scale of destructions that the Franks brought. Right, how many Moravians were defeated, and how much loot was collected. On this occasion, however, still, Rastislav's main fortress could not be seized, and the Franks ended up, as usually, from seasonally, to retreat, to withdraw at least. And the annals of Fulda say Louis the German ordered the Bavarians to assist Carloman, who wished to fight against Svatopluk, the nephew of Rastislav. He himself kept the Franks and elements with him to fight against Rastislav. When it was already time to set out, he fell ill and was compelled to leave the leadership to the army to Charles, his youngest son, and commend the outcome to God. Charles, when he came with the army with which he had been entrusted to Ratislav's huge fortification, quite unlike any built in olden times, with God's help burned with fire all the walled fortifications of the region, seized and carried off the treasures which had been hidden in the woods or buried in the fields, and killed or put to flight all who came against him. Carloman also laid waste the territory of Svatopluk, Rastislav's nephew, with fire and war. When the whole region had been laid waste, the brothers Charles and Carloman came together and congratulated each other on the victories bestowed by heaven. Right. So at this point, Svatopluk allied himself with the Franks, and even helped them to take Rastislav himself in 870. Right, so this is a further evidence of how still dependent the Moravians were on the Carolingians at this point. Carloman, as a consequence, took over Rastislav's realm, and appointed even two Frankish lords, William and Engelschalk, to rule over it. This was a substantial defeat, again, as we've seen, come after the umpteenth failure of the Moravians to keep the Franks out of their country. This brought also to the arrest of Archbishop Methodius, that was just moving from Rome to Moravia, and that represents the Frankish concern of the further autonomization of these lands under, in fact, an independent ecclesiastical organization. This shows some interesting issues with the papacy as well, and the Byzantines. In any case, at this point, you understand what happens. Svatopluk was forced to basically to sell out his uncle. Right, it was just, I think, first imprisoned in a monastery, then killed or something. He was or blinded and so on. So the matter was pretty serious, because now he had to rule over a people that had been suffering substantially from the Frankish domination, and that was, however, from Frankish invasion, that was now to be ruled by it. The opportunity was essentially to exploit the current difficulties of the country to rise in a rebellion, but the Franks arrested Svatopluk as well at the order of Louis the German in 871. And this is what triggered what we think was really the beginning of Great Moravia, right? Because these people rose up in open rebellion against the aforementioned Frankish governors, William and Engelschalk, electing temporarily a kinsman of Svatopluk, Slavomir, the Duke of Moravia. Right, at this point, Svatopluk managed to return to Moravia, take over the command of the insurgents, and even in driving away the Franks out of the country. So this, in 871, would be the beginning of a more, at least politically, right, a more robust cohesion of these populations against Frankish Empire. The following year, Louis the German predictably sent again his forces against Moravia, and again the Imperials plundered the countryside, but could not take it. Always the same thing, right? The extremely well fortified stronghold where Svatopluk had taken refuge, right? And Svatopluk must have been really a great leader, because in spite of this very painful invasions, he managed, even if exploiting also the desperation of the locals, in mastering an army that was so well driven, so motivated, so angry, let's say, that managed to defeat a consistent amount of Carolingian forces, obliging them to withdraw once again from Moravia. Right, this had been impressive, really, and Louis the German began negotiating a peace that would be concluded at Forchheim in May 874. And naturally, things had not magically changed, right? The annals of Fulda make it clear that in exchange for this peace, Svatopluk had sent at least an envoy that on his behalf stated that Moravia remained faithful. He would, because this was a personal rule, always remembered that, to Louis the German, quote, essentially till the end of his life, right? And the Moravian ruler was at this point also obliged to pay yearly tribute to the Eastern Frankish kingdom. So overall, again, we see, even at the at some of the most consistent levels of Moravian cohesion, that this was strongly under the orbit of the Franks, right? In the meanwhile, Methodius had been released by the Franks on demand of the Pope John VIII. We are in 873. The Archbishop returned to Moravia, and his life tells that the Prince Svatopluk and all the Moravians decided to entrust Methodius all the churches and the clergy in all the centers of Moravia at his arrival, right? So this phase saw an important work of translation of the scriptures with the assistance of the locals. In fact, in Slavonic, Methodius seemingly translated the entire scriptures except the books of the Maccabees, right? At least this according to what his life tells. However, the problem there is that the Franks were again wary of the fact that such measure could have boosted some kind of Moravian autonomistic identity feeling. That is exactly what they were trying to curb at the moment, and for this reason they accused Methodius of heresy, and this was really, the papacy didn't follow this, right? There was from Rome the full support to Methodius' activity, and also the confirmation of his orthodoxy, to appoint as Bishop of Nitra, as we've seen, one of the most important centers here, in fact, still seat of a Catholic diocese in Western Slovakia today, Byching, who was the main opponent of Methodius in Moravia, and who himself preferred the Latin rite. Right? We know, again, a relatively few about what was going on behind the scenes, but this is also fascinating because the need of homogenizing the ecclesiastical administration, etc., here was paradoxically preferred by the same people that was being here subdued, rather than by those who were trying to autonomize it from the same ecclesiastical spring. So naturally there must have been some political pressure and mechanisms between the actors here that we can't reconstruct. But it's this process would lead anyway to the baptism of the great part of the Moravians, right around 900 AD. The Archbishop Theodmar of Salzburg. These are the last years, by the way, of the Great Moravia. Says that the same Svatopluk had had defeated other peoples around him. Not, of course, we're talking about other Slavs mostly, and that he had essentially converted them from paganism to Christianity. Surely some of these peoples were not just part, in fact, of what would become Great Moravia at its largest extent, but also political opponents internally. So the need to stabilize, to accelerate this process of at least integration within the Carolingian Empire, so that it could have a greater autonomy in as much as they were fully Christian. There wasn't any of that kind of religious problem to motivate some military expeditions from the Franks, was really crucial, as much as the degree of power would derive from the establishment of churches, of monasteries in the land. Through this information, we know what is repeated, for example, by the life of Methodius, that Svatopluk was essentially expanding his own power at this point. So it's as if the final subjection to the Franks had actually increased the capacity of Moravia to expand, right? And thus expanding in a sense on behalf of the same Christendom, right, against this other kind of more recalcitrant people. So we are here in the 70s of the 9th century. At this point, Svatopluk also crossed the Vistula and crushed in present-day Poland a Slavic prince that had been persecuting Christians locally, allegedly. So you understand here, it's interesting because this thing would, by a degree, end, right? After Great Moravia, the Magyar injections, the general political, let's say ratios of strength change over time. But this could have started from Moravia, substantial, civilization, some sort, at least, nothing from 3000 AD, but I mean in the sense of at least altering those political balance between, for example, it would be later Bohemian, would rise in to greater power over Moravia, Still, at this point, they were quite connected. Fundamentally, Bohemia was fully part of what this greater Moravia was doing actively as a sort of a core land, but it was still not the proper center. In any case, the relation with the papacy continued. Svatopluk was called as Gloriosus Comes and Unicus Filius of the Holy See, interestingly enough, around 880. So this shows how close the relation of Moravia was with Rome at the point, because these titles, such as Glorious Count and Only Son of the Church, which is like, was used as a title just with the emperor. And so if this is not just this is the only son, right? So what about the emperor at this time, right? And this is the very end of the Carolingian Empire. There are lots of strains. I made a video about the Rome of Charles III. So the situation is really messed up and complicated. But again, the possibility of Moravia here to consolidate something bigger also internationally was quite there. In fact, the papacy granted the protection of the Holy See to Svatopluk, right, showing that something had properly shifted entirely, even in the relation with the Eastern Frankish rulers. There were some rivalries between, say, the French and the German party in Rome. Surely there was a connection with this, but thus trying to establish a series of churches that would be politically autonomous from one another and just connected to Rome overall. So quite even just an ambitious policy from the side of the papacy. Naturally, Svatopluk was just there, right, to exploit the situation. We know from the longer version of the Annals of Salzburg that were written between the 9th and the 10th century in the East Frankish stem duchy of Bavaria, that in 881 the Magyars and the Khazars raided in East Francia. And it's believed by some scholars at least that this raid occurred with at least the complacency of Svatopluk. Again, a mechanism that would have repeated itself later when Moravia was subjected by the Magyars, and it would be used as basically the launching platform for attacks deep into Eastern Frankish territory with the support, in fact, of the same Moravian, Bohemian forces. The reason of this raid may have been the tense relations between in fact, Svatopluk and Arnulf of Carinthia, that was the son of Carloman of East Francia, that at this point was administering the Mark of Pannonia. This shows, as we've seen before, that the general interferences of the Moravians with the Pannonian, say, Slavs and the Frankish districts established there were continuing. As a matter of fact, there would be, as we'll see now, under Svatopluk, an expansion south, right? And the Magyars naturally were quite useful in this frontier because they were starting to settle consistently in the area, and it was easy to mobilize them from there. This is not much a matter of strength, as we've seen. It's rather a shrewd plan just to remain equilibristically in charge and trying to avert to choking Frankish affirmation in the region, right? And the brutality, in fact, of these aims, it's well showed by a war fought in the same Mark of Pannonia from 882 to 884, which is known as the Wilhelmina War, which was initially a rebellion of the sons of the Margraves William II and Engelschalk I, led in fact by Engelschalk II, against the new Margrave Aribo, right? So in other words, this was part of what was happening to the rest of the Carolingian Empire. So this was even more of a frontier, the far east, the far southeast, and the general system was falling apart. And there were some, again, local officials that were installed next to, amongst at least the successors of previous rulers that had started de facto just dynasticizing power and entrenching their local possessions. So this began just like a minor crisis, as the many that existed in the Carolingian Empire, and similar things happened all over, the Slavic world as well. However, this essentially rendered the Markov Pannonia particularly weak in that moment, and the Moravians exploited this to lay Pannonia waste, right, according to the annals of Fulda, right, at least in the Bavarian version. So basically all the territories in this district to the east of the river Rab, whereas we've seen also part of the our refugees pressured by the Slavs were devastated. Regino of Prüm states that in spite of this devastating raid launched by Svatopluk, that seemingly had collected troops from all the Slav lands, just easily convincing them with loot, and so not just even from Great Moravia, by the way. Arnulf of Carinthia maintained control over Pannonia at the end of the hostilities in 884. Right, there was even a meeting in which the dukes, according to the sources, Svatopluk became the emperor's vassal, again, so swearing fidelity to him, promising also that he would never attack the emperor's realm again, a bit like it had been done in the past, as we've seen by Rastislav, etc. So this looks like essentially a major devastation carried out for still a relatively contained area, just to seize loot, to hopefully bring as much as possible home, and trying to centralize a little bit on that base, exploiting the weaknesses of this frontier in the Eastern Frankish kingdom in general. It had been having substantial problems on its own anyway. When Methodius died in 885, as we've seen, the Bishop Viking of Nitra, that had opposed him, took advantage of the Archbishop's death, so much so that he managed to convince Pope Stephen V to restrict further the use of Old Church Slavonic in the local liturgy through the bull Quia te Zelo. The Viking managed even to expel all of Methodius' disciples from Moravia in 886. This is again fascinating, and this again was like actually a blow to the capacity of Moravia to develop much of a kind of just a literary language differentiated by the rest of the surrounding peoples. Eventually would go on, and as we've seen, Bohemia actually becoming the most important center. And it's worth mentioning that especially Slovakia wouldn't really have a literary language on its own basically until the 19th century. So admittedly, as we are observing here, Great Moravia was not much of a of a stable power, not even one provided with, say, an enormous potential. But, right, the fact that it managed to stay afloat even through all these issues, and that probably, as we've seen, had a broader international connection, even further down the Danube, even with the papacy originally, still shows, like, with the chronological continuity, that there was more that this area could do. It could become a greater center without, especially the modern territory of Slovakia, being transformed essentially in a northern frontier of Hungary, and Moravia falling at least on a secondary level compared to Bohemia. In the meanwhile, in the aforementioned Bolquia Zelo, Svatopluk is called Sventopolko Regi Sklavorum. In other words, this guy had, in the meanwhile, been crowned king. We are at the end of the of 885, right? So this sense of kingship, we don't know whether it was just Rome or, the Franks actually called occasionally Svatopluk in their annals as a king, right? Especially in connection with events revolving around this time, right? So it may have been a thing, witnessing how consistent, still by this point, Moravian power was, right? There are some later sources that claim, one for example of the 12th century, the Chronicle of the Priest of Diocletian is not very reliable from a historical point of view, stating that Svatopluk had been crowned king on this field of the Dalma in the presence of a papal legate. Who knows, right? If it was to happen, likely it could have happened like that. The problem is that we do not really have any evidence that the source philologically might have been connected with some more reliable one from 300 years ago. So Moravia definitely reached the peak under Svatopluk's reign, right? There is also evidence that at this point Arnulf of Carinthia gave to Svatopluk and the Moravian Slavs the command over the Bohemians, right? Stressing what I was saying before, that Moravia was at that point definitely more important than Bohemia within this heartland. There is some hint about the fact that Silesia and Lusatia in the early 90s of the 9th century were part of Great Moravia as some kind of tributaries mostly, just because they were sucked in this broader domination, but say likely wasn't much of a war or permanent occupation, also because Great Moravia was about to be overrun. In all this, their relation with the Frankish kings remained tense. Right, the annals of Fulda say that Arnulf of Carinthia proposed to Svatopluk a meeting in 892, but Svatopluk, in his usual fashion, the source says, refused to come to the king, right, and thus betrayed his fidelity in all the things he had promised before, actually. As a consequence, Arnulf invaded again Moravia in 892. Remember the Slavs as fanatic defenders. Well, that's a thing. Guess how it ended? Even this time, plunder, etc. This time even with Magyar cavalry that supported the Eastern Frankish king against the Moravians, but he could not defeat Svatopluk, who was just, closed behind, the gates of his fortified position. So the pattern repeats itself, except here you see the Magyars that essentially escape control of the same Moravians at this point. So things are actually going down. And the thing is, really escalates quickly after the death of Svatopluk himself in 894. Reginald Froome describes the man as most prudent among his people and also very cunning by nature. So this gives you a bit the profile of these rulers, say very cautious about everything, but always ready to seize any kind of opportunity. So as we've seen, cooperating with the Franks, but exploiting any chance to kind of strengthen themselves as possible. Svatopluk was succeeded by his son Moimir II, that is a bit of a weak figure, because it's not much the fact that he would die, as we'll see now, in battle against the Magyars, but the same, say, those who had made up Great Moravia began to part from this political enterprise. Let's say they began to think mostly about themselves. There was a process of also a further increase in importance of the nobility. Say these same lands were gradually facing the problem that the same Franks, with their vassalitic beneficiary system, had been suffering of, and the Bohemian dukes, for example, that were based in the area of Prague at this point, preferred to accept Arnulf of Carinthia's suzerainty in June 895. Right. In the following years, Moimir II tried to recover the control over Bohemia. The thing failed, and Bohemia was, as we've seen, an important chunk of the world system. So, already showing the ambitions and the potential that, as we've seen, Prague, from which really the Bohemian power developed from, really were. There was, at least under this ruler, the further strengthening of the Moravian Church under the Pope John the Ninth, who sent also his legates to Moravia in the last years of the 9th century. On this occasion, the legates installed an archbishop and 3 bishops as his suffragans in Moravia. It was an important ecclesiastical province, right? Nitra was the most relevant center, and this would remain so, in fact. There was also familiar tension between Moimir II and his younger brother, Svatopluk II, right, which evidence again the internal problems with different nobiliary factions supporting either of the two. This gave an interesting opportunity to the King Arnulf to invade Moravia in 898 and 899. Svatopluk II, according to the Annals of Fulda, was rescued during this war by the Bavarian forces from the dungeon of the settlement in which he had been placed by his brother, together with his men, in 899. It's likely that Svatopluk II had inherited the Principality of Nitra himself, while the Principality of Moravia was, in the hands of his brother, right? So, the center being properly the latter, right? And Nitra, however, increasing in power over time. If it wasn't for the fact that the Bavarians, however, destroyed the same fortress, of the settlement on this occasion, causing a substantial damage. The Magyars were coalescing and being a very punching force, right? Having come fresh from the Eurasian steppes meat grinder. They were a nomadic people of Graphic origin that really didn't have much to do with the Slavs, and that considered these as fundamentally lesser people in their, kind of heavenly obsession with divine rule and imperial ambitions, looting, and so on. So much so that the Hungarians began to devastate what had been the territories of Great Moravia, especially the heartland, after their settlement in the Carpathian Basin. Their rule by this point extending already up to the Ron River, Kron, I think it's called. It's a long left tributary of the Danube in Slovakia, also the second largest river in the country, by the way. There is a letter of Theodmar of Salzburg that states how, by the beginning of the 10th century, the Moravians and the Bavarians were off-plotting with the Magyars, and specifically by means of some, quote, abominable and pagan customs involving the means of dogs and wolves, right, which is fascinating because naturally the steppes and generally speaking migration era symbolism there was still deeply felt, right? There were many wolves also among the Christianized Germans at that point, so the thing mostly still having to do, however, in this case, especially from, let's say, the from the Bishop Theodmar Salzburg and his suffragans, right? So something more horrifyingly connected with the superficial Christianization, especially of this Eastern world. Let's say, naturally, the Hungarians were pagans. The imperial ambassador Liutprand of Cremona states that the Magyars already, quote, claimed for themselves the nation of the Moravians, which King Arnulf had subdued with the aid of their might. Right, so the usage, as we've seen, of Magyar war bands was already a thing, and this is basically after the coronation of Arnulf's son Louis the Child in 900 AD. There are the Annals of Grado. These are northern Italian sources saying that a large Magyar host had attacked and invaded the Moravians exactly in 900. Right, and under this major threat, Moimer II concluded a peace treaty with Saint Louis the Child the year after. So there is a bit of a problem concerning not just the beginning, but also the end of the concept of Great Moravia, right? Even though we lack even evidence that they called themselves like that for that matter. Surely we can see that by the beginning of the 10th century with the Magyar invasions and occupation, the political control of the land switched from the locals to the newcomers, right? Moravia was not to be really was to remain Slavic, right? It was to remain also later on, as you know, within the Bohemian sphere of influence and so on. So there were some territories south of Moravia, so in Slovakia mostly, that instead would fall into the Magyar orbit, and they had been the ones mostly that had been already under the Avars back in the day for different reasons, but in general, again, this greater extension of the plains in the south and the greater accessibility of certain fortresses there. So it would be interesting to consider how the same Moravians had seen this greater expansion of their powers. You understand, here on all medieval history manuals, we say the Great Moravia, but it's just an historiographical term, right? You see here that there wasn't actually much of when you think of Great Moravia, you may expect something, I don't know, this people ruling over others, or being, just free, powerful reality. Actually, it really wasn't, as we've seen for most of this time. They were essentially Carolingian clients, and eventually were taken over by the Magyars, right? They had a substantial resistance, a sense of themselves, a capacity to gather a considerable amount of forces, and even disrupting, as we've seen, the neighbors' control in certain areas. But overall, this happened mostly in peripheral areas, and without much of a potential for further growth. Right, the ecclesiastical development there is quite interesting. It tells you how, how much potential existed, at least in this space originally, but that seems to go in parallel with the lack of with this interludium between the Avars and the Magyars. Right, as soon as somebody came to dominate the Hungarian steppes as well, we see this power essentially vanishing, the center shifting towards Prague, Bohemia. And I made a video about the rise of the Przemyslids that would have occurred later on. So surely there was an important legacy here, also from Samuel's times, from these same, from, as we've seen, from the influence received by the same nomads and the same Franks. Right, on again, a nation that remained in its forests, in its mountains, in some of its most sheltered plains, right? But the Slavic sedentary, and that gradually would fall, as we've seen in that video about also I think the Hungarian warfare of at least the high and late Middle Ages, markedly Western, at least Frankish in type of arms and armor and similar things. Right, so this is an important aspect. We have the customs or regulations of Raffelstätten, which is the only legal document regulating customs, at least in early medieval Europe in this area. It's preserved. You can find it in the MGH online. This was issued between 903 and 906, and in these years, of course, we find through this document the presence of the markets of the Moravians, which may not have much to do with the existence of an independent Moravian policy, but just the fact that there was, still a connection between these various places. Naturally, the Magyar interference lasted. The interference potentially was there, but it was not just a direct occupation. So surely a Moravian market was there even after the Greater Moravia expired. Let's put it in this way. What really seems to have marked, however, been the greatest or final blow to Greater Moravia was the famous Battle of Pressburg in 907, where fundamentally the Hungarians defeated this major army of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, led by Louis the Child, Luitpold, Margrave of Bavaria, that died in battle, and Dietmar, Archbishop of Salzburg, but also the Moravians, right? That would again change field eventually later on, because again they would pass mostly from the side of, they were a bit squishy, let's say, but they, as we've seen, assisted the Magyars, or at least they were forced to by a degree to harass Francia, so keeping to do essentially, even helping these Western Slavs at some point to pass on the offensive on the Frankish territory. In any case, there is the first legend of Saint Naum that describes this debacle. It was really a massacre, right? It was the largest victory, basically, that the Magyars scored against the post-Carolingians, which says the Moravian land, according to the prophecy of the holy Archbishop Methodius, was promptly punished by God for their lawlessness and heresy, for the banishment of the Orthodox fathers, and for the torments inflicted on the latter by the heretics with whom they had acquiesced. This is talking about as we've seen, all those troubles that had occurred in Moravia for Christianizing, not Christianizing. This is by the way, a medieval Bulgarian writer from the same period, so it's talking exactly from the same years in which the battle had occurred. I mean, just after, because he died in 910, so it's just a few years, within a few years' time span. And in a few years, the Magyars came, so here's God's punishment, a people of Paeonia, their strange Bulgarian, classicistically Byzantinely influenced kind of ethnographic issues, never mind, sacked their land and devastated it. But Methodius' disciples were not captured by the Magyars, for they fled to the Bulgarians, of course. However, the land remained desolated under the rule of the Magyars. And this may be like a bit of a, I don't pretend to be in the mind or criticizing somebody writing from the early 10th century. They knew much more than us. But it's interesting because, first of all, cited the Bulgarian awareness of what was going on in this context, but in general, the sense that the Moravia had, in a sense, wanted too much, it just gives this sensation that they had tried to survive, they had tried to push their boundaries, to stay afloat against such a big thing like the Carolingians, right? And managing, exploiting shrewdly, skillfully the weaknesses of the eastern frontier of the empire, but eventually not really succeeding in, stabilizing a power that could keep other peoples like the Magyars out. So this opens to another phase of Moravian history that we will see in another video, but that makes you reflect again of what could have been, what could have existed, right? And doesn't end here, because again, these are really brief, short introductions, because even just following in detail what this actual policy, the contrast between even the papacy and the Franks regarding how Moravia had to be handled, and relations with the Byzantines and the Bulgarians, that here admittedly we left a bit out of the game, but were very, very important for Moravian policy at some points, is really just food for another video, right? Today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.